Okay, so I forgot to mention in the last episode that the great Tom Lehrer had died. In honor of his passing, instead of the usual opening theme, I'm going to play one of his songs that's appropriate. I should point out that one of the last things he did was put all of his music in the public domain, so in theory, there should be no issue with me doing this.
First you get down on your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Do whatever steps you want if you have cleared them with the pontiff. Everybody say his own Kyrie eleison, doing the Vatican rag. Get in line in that processional, step into that small confessional. There the guy who's got religion'll tell you if your sin's original. If it is, try playing it safer. Drink the wine and chew the wafer. 2, 4, 6, 8. Time to transubstantiate. So get down upon your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Make a cross on your abdomen when in Rome. Do like a Roman. Ave Maria. Gee, it's good to see you. Getting ecstatic and sort of dramatic and doing the Vatican rag.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, located not far from the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist Indian Trailer Park Podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in the kitchen enjoying his can of wet food. Lord Nibbler has already polished his off and is reclining in the doorway. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. And this, for reasons that I will explain in a bit, is a history episode. Next episode will be Skullbeard and I reading from Satan's World, the Scottish Demonology book. Now, got lots of stuff to go over. Gonna try to get through them so I can get to the other stuff. I don't remember if I've mentioned it in past episode or not. I fucked up the bike, the new bike. It's not bad. There was a little back and forth with the company I bought it from. Because I was like, hey, fuck the bike up. It's my fault. Can you sell me a new motor? Which is what I needed. I'll pay full price. It's not a warranty issue. And they sold me. They gave me the motor under warranty. So, that's cool. The motor showed up. Put it on the bike. Everything seemed okay. And then it started fucking up. Now, fortunately, I didn't damage anything. I caught it. I was like, all right, I know what's going on here. So, I discovered that on Sunday, so I have not had time to fix the bike. I've been back on the old bike, which, it's 15 miles an hour slower, which is kind of annoying, but not nearly as annoying as the fact that the brakes don't work quite right on it. I'm not sure what the issue is, and I don't really have time to fix them. So I'm having to Fred Flintstone the stops. Oh, and before we go any farther, it being the first of the month, I want to thank all the folks who support the podcast on Patreon. You're getting some bonus content in the near future. I can't say exactly when or what it'll be, but you'll be getting some bonus content here in the near future. And y'all got a discount last month because I fucked up. When I first started using Patreon, their settings were not really clear as to whether or not if you uploaded something, people would be charged for it. So I tended not to upload things that would be a free episode because I didn't want anybody charged for them. Then they changed the interface. It's fine. It made perfect sense. Okay, I'm loading this episode and it's a free one. So, no big deal, blah, blah, blah. They've changed the interface again. And you got to jump through some hoops to make sure you tick the box that says charge or have it be a free episode. So apparently I forgot to tick the box a couple of times last month, so you folks got some free episodes. I'm not complaining. I'm just, if you're wondering what's going on, now you know. And part of why, how much does this stuff cost? Has part of the reason why that's popped into my head is because so I got paid last night, right? Direct deposit, and I don't think anything about it because I don't have time to worry about it. I just know, hey, I got my money. Good. So go to the store after I get off work, buy something, and because I learned the hard way, anytime my card is ran, I get a notification on my phone. Bing! I get the notification. Hey, you bought this stuff at Food Lion, which I did, and here's your balance. Ooh, there's way too much money in my account. So I get home and I pull up and I'm like, they deposited work deposited. It's not double, but it's a huge. It's like if I worked 8 hours or more overtime in a week. Okay, I don't know what's going on here. So, get into work today, and they're like, oh, yeah, we made a mistake and we overpaid everybody. We don't know how we'll be getting that money back, so don't spend it, but we're going to be getting our money back. It's like, man. Okay. I figured as much. Would have made my life a hell of a lot easier if that's actually what I made every week. But it isn't. So, and since I don't know how they're going to be reclaiming their money, I'm really having to watch my spending. Because I don't want to inadvertently blow too much. And then, find out that, oh fuck, I don't have as much as I thought if they pull their money back or whatever they do. Or, I would hope that what they're going to do is say, okay, just your next couple of checks will be short X amount of dollars. That's what I would like for them to do. Whether or not they'll do that, I don't know. But I may not get a check next week. So we'll just have to see. Okay, so now let me get to why this is a history episode. I said before I went on my break, got to rethink how I do the podcast, and I thought I had it all worked out, and had the script done and everything, and I was about halfway through, and I said, no, this isn't quite right. This is not how I want to be doing things. And I'm not going to say I've got it sorted out, but I think I've got a better idea. At least I know what what was wrong with what I had planned. So I'm doing this episode, which was inspired by a podcast, and I'll link that into the show notes if you want to hear it. But I'm not cribbing from that particular podcast. I'm just using what they did as a jumping off point for a couple of reasons. I want you to imagine, okay, that you're a surgeon and you brought a patient. Patient is a teenager. They've been shot in the face. The bullet is lodged deep inside their skull, very near the spinal cord or the brainstem, right? And it's going to be a delicate procedure, no matter what you do, and you've got to get that bullet out of there. And I know I have at least 2 people in the medical field who listen to the podcast. So if I get things wrong, let me know. But I think you would all agree that the first thing you would do is you would clean and disinfect the wound. Then you would get the bullet out. And then, you again clean and disinfect the wound, because there's going to be stuff under the bullet that you've got to get out. And next, you're going to want to make sure that the wound heals from the inside out, because that reduces the chance of infection. And so, as part of that every day, you're going to have to clean and disinfect the wound and put fresh bandages on it. Right? I'm leaving a few minor things out that I'll get to in a moment. But I think we can all agree that sounds like a modern surgical practice. That's what you would do in the 21st century. But I'm not describing an operation that happened in the 21st century. I'm not describing an operation that happened in the 20th century or even the 19th century. I'm describing an operation that happened in 1403. Okay, now I fudged things because I said a bullet when actually it's an arrowhead. But that's an actual operation that happened in 1403. We know this because we have the account of the surgeon, a guy by the name of John Bradmore. His patient was a 16-year-old boy who would go on to become Henry V of England. Now, here's a couple of things that he did that I left out. He used a couple of different methods that should sterilize the wound, and he used something that may have been a clotting agent to stop the bleeding. I don't know for certain it was a clotting agent. I'll get to that. Because when at the Battle of Shrewsbury, the Crown Prince, Henry, who later became Henry V, the guy the Shakespearean plays about. He was 16. He got shot in the face with an arrow. They they got when they pulled on the shaft came out, but the arrowhead stayed in there. So they, got the royal surgeon. The royal surgeon cleaned the wound with warm wine and an herbal tea made from some herbs that are said to be astringent, so that means they're disinfectants. I don't know for certain that those herbs actually have astringent properties, but that's what they're credited with. And he very carefully extracted the bullet, or the arrowhead, cleaned the wound again, used the astringents, and used another herb that's said to clot the blood. Again, I don't know if those herbs actually do what they're said to do. Certainly there are all kinds of plant-based compounds that have medicinal value, but it's not always clear if the belief is accurate to what actually it does. And other things that I've left out is that the surgical instruments he used were dipped in honey, which has some antibacterial properties, but I don't think that's necessarily what the key factor here is. I suspect that all his surgical tools, because they had to keep the wound open for a long period of time. I can't think of the name of that medical procedure that they use. But if you've got if you're born with, say, one leg shorter than the other, they have this medical procedure where they cut the bone on your leg that's shorter down to the marrow, and they put these implants into the bone, and they gradually adjust them so that your bone, the bone in your leg slides down the marrow, and once, your feet are even, they stop adjusting it, and they let bone fill in the gap created by that, so you no longer have one leg that's shorter than the other. It was developed by a Russian. It's an expensive procedure. It's not commonly done, I don't think. But they did that with the guy with the hole in Henry V's face. Basically, they didn't stretch it open, but what they did was they held it open, and they watched as the lower parts of the wound healed up, and then they pulled the spreaders out a little bit to allow the lower parts. Again, this is done so that you don't have to worry about so much about an infection forming inside the body, which you might have to if the wound healed from the outside in. And again, this is 1403. There are no antibiotics at this point in time. Germ theory is over 400 years away, and I'll get to that in a bit. One thing that I suspect I cannot confirm is that almost certainly the medical instruments that Bradmore was using would have been gold, silver, some kind of gold alloy, or silver or brass. I seriously doubt that he would have used iron. Not merely because iron alloys in the human body tend not to get along unless it's stainless steel, which had not been discovered at that point. But this is the Crown fucking Prince. You're not going to operate on him with base metals like iron. And apparently Bradmore had done not an identical surgery, but a surgery that was similar to this. He reportedly saved the life of a guy who'd been stabbed twice in the gut, which, again, we're talking we're talking 1400. That normally would be fatal and a horrible way to go, but this guy apparently survived. Besides being less likely to react with the human body, gold, silver, and brass are natural antibiotics. There's something about the way the shape of the molecules, so that when bacteria hit them, they just break apart. The people who take colloidal silver are not entirely wrong in that it can have a positive effect, but they're not doing it the right way most of the time. So it's entirely possible that because the instruments he was using were made out of metals that were naturally antibacterial, it solved the it helped prevent infection spreading, along with the other things that they did. Now, this, again, was before germ theory was a thing. And if you want a really fascinating history of germ theory, look up Ignaz Semmelweis. He's the guy who figured it all out, and the medical establishment's reward was to have him committed to an insane asylum where he was promptly murdered by the staff. And even then, Semmelweis hadn't figured out the exact mechanism of disease, of germs, but he, was smart enough to say, hey, if you wash your fucking hands after you visit the morgue and you wear clean clothing when you examine your patient, that patient is less likely to die of some disease. We do not know how Bradmore figured out how to do this. And I should point out that one of the disinfectants that Bradmore used was warm wine, which has alcohol in it, so even if the herbs didn't do any disinfecting, the wine did. Now, Roger Bacon in the West is generally credited with coming up with the scientific method. That's not entirely correct, and I'm not getting into the lengthy details. But, I have no way of knowing if Bradmore was familiar with Roger Bacon and and him pushing the scientific method. Clearly, however, Bradmore employed it, and he had to have done it significantly prior to Henry V being injured, because otherwise he couldn't have done as much as he did. He certainly, he may not have put all the pieces together until that point, but he had most of them. And given the fact that he'd previously treated a guy with an abdominal injury, he probably had, all of them or 99% of them figured out. But we don't know, from what I can gather, the path that took him there. From, just being some dude to somebody who can perform a surgical procedure in a nearly identical manner as somebody would 500, 600 years later. Right? And unlike Sir Isaac Newton, who hid a lot of his stuff, because Isaac Newton was an alchemist, and he thought his alchemy was more important than his physics, which is what we know him for today. And people have, respectable historians, I want to add that, have figured out, I don't know about Isaac Newton, but they have figured out that some of the alchemists, were writing in code when they said, well, you take eye of newt and wool of whatever, right? They were actually writing in a code, and they were doing chemistry experiments that sometimes yielded useful results and other times didn't. And even though in 1865, we figured out, hey, you should sterilize surgical instruments. Medical people should wash their hands. They should wear clean garbs. We did not understand that things like bacteria and viruses could cause disease until significantly later. How much later? Well, it depends on the illness. But the 1919 flu pandemic was raging for a long period of time before they ever figured out that it was a virus that caused the pandemic. They didn't know for a long chunk of it what it was. They just knew people were getting sick and dying of a weird pneumonia type thing. They had no clue that it was a virus doing it for the longest period of time. If I'm not mistaken, they figured out that it was transmitted through the air long before they figured out that it was a virus, and that it was not. Basically, they figured out, it's airborne, so everybody mask up and isolate yourself, and that'll stop it. And it was in the final days of the pandemic that they said, it's a virus. It's a version of the flu virus. And I think I don't recall exactly if it was the first time they said, the first thing they ever called the flu virus, and then going back through historical records, they realized, no, there was there has been the flu in the past or not. But they basically, it was a, it was a watershed moment in medical science when they figured all of that out. But again, let's go back to Bradmore. He basically had figured out, without microscopes or all kinds of things, that we take for granted today how to safely operate on somebody and, not cause them to have an infection. Mind you, anesthesia wasn't really a thing then either. So there are plants that they would have had access to and probably would have known about, like morning glories, that couldn't be used to knock you out if they're mixed with like wine. But that's unless you're, you're somebody who uses the scientific method, and you know that X amount of morning glories mixed with X amount of wine will knock somebody out who weighs this amount. It's a bit of a crapshoot, and even then, weights and measures weren't really standardized in the way we think of them today, so there still would have been some variability. So there's a good chance that somebody had to strap Henry down while they did all this, and even though he was doped up a bit, he still probably would have felt all of it. Now, Bradmore wrote his book on medical procedures in the early 1400s. Well, no, 50 years or more before the printing press was invented and made its way to the UK. Apparently, a handful of copies of Bradmore's book have survived from ancient times to today, but it certainly wasn't widely spread back then. And before I started recording, I tried to do a quick search to see if I could find a copy of it, and that had been translated into modern English. It was originally written in Latin, and I was hoping that there would be, a copy in at least some version of English that I can read, rather than ye old ancient English. But I haven't found anything. So I can't comment on the contents of it exactly, how much he got right and what he got wrong. And hop forward 600 years roughly to the COVID pandemic. And we figure out how to make an mRNA vaccine, and boom, we start sharing that information all over the world. We tell everybody, hey, this is what the virus looks like. We think you do this, this, and this, and you can make a vaccine for it. And we'll hash out the details later. Now, we could do that not only because we had, fantastic technology, but because we had a system in place, not only for sharing information, but for ensuring that that information is credible. I know I mentioned that I said earlier the alchemists wrote in code, and that sometimes we figured out, well, yeah, actually they were doing chemistry, but they weren't the only ones. The forceps, the one, the salad spoon looking things that they use to help with birth. They were invented in 1500s, right? And the family that invented them were, doctors and midwives. They figured out, this family in the 1500s figured out, hey, if we make these forceps, we can help women with, who are having a difficult birth. And rather than sharing that information, they took elaborate steps to keep it a secret, because that meant they could command the highest price. Because if you had one of them attending the birth of your child, odds are the child and the mother would survive the birth. And when you consider the fact that the mortality rate in that period of time for somebody giving birth could be as high as 30%, that's kind of important. And I do not know when, but at some point in human history, we started to realize that, we need to share stuff like this. We cannot keep it a secret. It's too important. I mean, just think if Bradmore's surgical ideas about how to clean wounds had become commonplace starting in the 1400s. Who knows how many people would have survived? Because we know that the discovery of germ theory has saved countless lives. I've said in previous episodes that science really didn't seem to get going until Darwin published his Origin of Species. And Darwin wasn't the first person to come up with the idea. Some guy named Wallace basically had the same idea, and there's contention as to whether or not that Darwin stole it from Wallace. I don't know. What I do know is that Darwin's Origin of Species was not published until after he had decades of evidence compiled. And he put that in the book. So, he did that because he's like, well, I'm kind of shitting all over the concept of God here. So I've got to make sure that I have my case as airtight as possible. And you start seeing around that same time, whether it's one was influenced by the other, I don't know. All the various sciences getting more serious about documenting their cases and their evidence. Medicine, however, not quite as good as you would like. What we know as the double-blind medical study, that didn't come around until the 1950s. Yeah, that late. And even then, they weren't really as good as one would like. And it was only with the AIDS crisis in the 1980s that doctors said, oh, okay, if we're running a drug trial and the drug shows really promising results, we're going to go ahead and stop the trial and just start handing the drug out to everybody who needs it, because it's unethical to continue the trial when you've got all these positive results. At the same time, they also said, oh, and if we're partway through the drug trial and it's pretty obvious that it ain't doing shit, and or it's making things worse for people, we'll go ahead and stop the trial because again, it's unethical to continue it. One of the things that I learned in reading about quality control and quality assurance was the key, the absolute key was standardization. Because once you had standardized the procedure, then you could begin to look at, okay, there's a problem with this step or that step, or, hey, we can do this better. And, it doesn't matter how wrong Brad Moore was in the other medical stuff that he did, if his overall procedures had been adopted as the standard for medical treatment in the 1400s, not only would lots more people have survived, but we would have figured out other things as well. We eventually would have figured out, hey, we follow his this stuff that he says, the bulk of our people survive, our patients survive, but we follow this other stuff of his, the bulk of our patients don't survive. Maybe that other stuff is wrong. Now, some months back, maybe even a year or so ago, I don't remember exactly when, there was a drug developed that had a 99% success rate at preventing HIV infections. During the drug trials, the researchers stopped the trial because they're like, it is unethical for us to continue this trial and not make this a drug available to more people because it is so effective. 2 shots a year and you're immune to HIV. That, done properly, that drug enables us to wipe out HIV. And why wouldn't you want to do that? I mean, yes, there's possibilities we can find ways to cure people who are HIV positive so they don't have to worry. I mean, there's already been some discoveries made that in limited cases can cure people, and they point to things that would enable us to cure anybody who's infected. But let's say we could, we lack the brain power to figure out exactly how to cure the disease, but we can ensure that nobody gets it in the future. Well, then the disease will die out, like smallpox did. Okay? So why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you support that? Well, I mean, I'm not saying this as somebody who, is an advocate for science. I'm saying this as somebody who had to watch an awful lot of people die slowly, painfully, and horribly from HIV. And, that's not counting the discrimination and other abuse heaped upon them because they were HIV positive. Just the disease itself was horrific, what it did to people. It shouldn't take you witnessing such things for you to say, well, I don't want anybody to go through anything like that. Let's fund the shit so that nobody has to worry about that. But that's not where we are in this world. The government is gutting funding for the drug that prevents people from getting HIV. The government is also gutting funding to mRNA vaccine research. Yes, they are doing it so they can give tax breaks to billionaires, but they wouldn't consider that if they understood things. And when I say understood things, I don't merely mean they understood some of the science behind it, but if they understood the victims were human beings. Remember, during the pandemic, they were saying, oh, well, we have to end the lockdowns because if we don't, it's going to cause problems for the economy. You know, I'm sure grandma would be willing to sacrifice her life to keep the economy going. That's not a thing that anyone should have to do. And in the case of mRNA vaccines, 24 hours after the genome of COVID-19 had been published on the web, they were already spitting out the first candidate vaccines to stop that. You know, to protect people against COVID. Now, reportedly, the drug manufacturer who has come up with the drug that'll prevent people from contracting HIV is doing everything they can so that people can get the drug. They're waiving royalty fees. They're doing stuff so that even though the U.S. is no longer supporting such efforts, we won't have so many people dying. But one of the promises that mRNA vaccines offer us is you can pick any cancer out there. You know, say one that has, you know, that is eminently treatable. The fact is, we cannot get to 100% cure rate for any cancer, basically, because there's always some group of individuals who have that type of cancer, and for whatever reason, the best treatments we have don't work on that cancer as it's expressed in them. You know, biology is messy. Sometimes there's I can remember hearing I don't remember if she was a doctor or a nurse, but she was talking about there was this young guy who was a patient in her hospital, and he was there for something. I don't remember what the condition was, and she looked, you know, while he was futzing around with stuff, she noticed he had a mark on his back, and I cannot remember the name of the condition that this indicated, but if you have this, odds are you're somebody who's on immunosuppressive drugs because you've had an organ transplant, or you're HIV positive. And she said, that looks like, you know, is it Kaposi sarcoma, I think? Anyway, she says, whatever, that looks like you got such and such condition. And the guy says, yeah, I kind of thought that's what it was, but I wasn't really worried about it since we got all these treatments for HIV now. And she said that, they ran tests. Sure enough, he was HIV positive. And unfortunately, because he waited so long to get tested, they were not able to find the correct treatment cocktail for him, drug cocktail, before he succumbed to HIV. And had he gotten treatment as soon as it manifested himself, he might still be alive. If we do some more work with mRNA vaccines, we might be able to figure out a way, okay, so we can say, all right, standard treatments for your disease won't work, but because we've got a sample of the virus that's causing your problems, or the tumor that's causing your problems, or possibly even the bacteria that's causing your problem, we can run it through this machine and develop a vaccine that is 99% likely to enable your body to cure yourself. To fight the infection, to fight the virus, to fight the tumor. But they're gutting the federal funds to research that because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a nutbag. Related to that, somewhat obliquely, I guess I should say, is the issue I'm dealing with. My eldest brother is a Trumper. And he, he's in the cult. And I'm using the cult in the fullest sense of the word. Why I do that is because I need to point out another issue with American society that is often not talked about. Now, here's the thing I need to point out. The month I was born, my parents moved into the house that I grew up in. This was in a small town, New Albany, Ohio. And previously I think they lived in Grove City. I don't remember. It was not New Albany. And New Albany had, my graduating class in high school was 56 people, most of whom I'd known since kindergarten, if not before. Right. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. And Grove City was a significantly larger town. Wasn't a major city or anything like that in Ohio, but, I can tell you the year I graduated, Grove City's graduating class was far larger than mine. Anyways, family moved there the year I was born. My oldest brother's 15 years older than me. My middle brother is 10 years older than I am. So, and because the school system, again, very small, I had the same teachers, I don't, middle brother, I don't think, there may have been one or two elementary school teachers that me and my middle brother had in common, or they at least knew him. My eldest brother was in middle school, and there were, I benefited because when I went to middle school and high school, a lot of the same teachers my elder brothers had were still teaching. So, oh, you're so and so's brother. I'm, you know, you're a good kid automatically. And why I say this was because some of my high school teachers, including ones that my eldest brothers had, were very good at their jobs. History teacher. He took history very, very seriously. He had been a student at Kent State during the shootings. And when we would cover the American the lead up to the American Revolution, because the Boston Massacre was some years before the American Revolution. But when we would cover the Boston Massacre, he would compare it to the shootings at Kent State. Now, one person who was different from when my brothers went to high school and I went to high school, who's important, was the principal. I don't know the name of the principal my brothers had, and the principal I had is immaterial. But I can remember my eldest brother talking about how when he was in high school, if he was bored, he'd just go down to the principal's office and talk to the principal. Why? Because the principal was good friends with our next door neighbor. And so, they'd talk, and, the principal would say to my brother sometimes, shouldn't you be in class? And my brother's like, they're not teaching me anything I don't already know, which isn't true. And my eldest brother also graduated a year early. I need to point out that this was in 71 or 72. I forget the exact year. It doesn't really matter. But, the thing about that era is somebody could graduate from high school with, they didn't have to have great grades. They didn't have to, understand certain things. But they could graduate from high school and they could go out and they could get a job as an auto mechanic, which had things turned out slightly different. That's what my brother would have been. Or a few other fields, and had a decent living. When I was in high school, we had a program called DACA. Don't ask me what it stands for. I don't know. But a lot of seniors took advantage of it because they would be in school half the day, and then they could go work a job the rest of the school day. And, they would still have enough credits that they needed to graduate. And when I say work a job, I mean, you could work at a fast food restaurant, and that would be, that would count for DACA. And I'm not belittling people who work in fast food industries. I have done it myself. My point with this is that we had a mindset that, this person, for whatever reason, is never going to have a career more advanced than, a particular occupation. Again, not belittling an occupation. So we don't really need to worry if they understand literature or if they understand this or that or whatever, because they're never going to use it in their field. But what we fail to grasp is that since these people were not exposed to certain things, when some fascist runs for president on a platform that, has been just, handily proven not to work, they don't have the skill set to figure out that he's full of shit. My brother thinks Trump raising tariffs is the greatest thing in the world because it'll allow plants to be built in the U.S., blah, blah, blah. And it's like, dude, we had the same history teacher. Were you not in class on the day when he talked about the Smoot-Hawley Act and how that fucked everything up during the Great Depression? And the answer, of course, is yes. There are things that people are just not going to grasp because whatever reason. And this is not a slight against anybody who can't grasp things. I have discovered the hard way there is a limit to my ability to grasp math. Now, part of that is probably because most of my math teachers weren't really that good, but there's also a good chance that a lot of it has something to do with the fact that I'm just not wired that way. There are people who cannot grasp aspects of art or literature or what have you. I cannot tell you how many times I am astounded at somebody saying, well, I just didn't, believe, I can't believe that this character did that. And it's like, dude, the fucking detailed explanation as why that character did this or that. It was practically a flashing neon sign in the story we're talking about. But somehow you missed it, okay? But you're good at something else that I'm not, and I'll never be because it's not something I'm interested in. But over the years, one of the things that I have learned and come to appreciate about my education and the fact that I'm this massively ADD autistic individual is that shit I have an interest in and pay attention to, but I never be able to utilize, somehow still manages to pay off in the real world. I will never forget, and I've mentioned this before in the podcast, me and an artist friend were talking one time about color theory and how light interacts with color and things like that. And I go to the job where we have these consultants who are, they're doing all this shit to make the company more efficient. Many of which, if the company had listened to the shit that the employees had tried to tell them, they would have done years ago. And anyways, one of the problems that they suddenly had, because they had this new system where the shipping labels were going to be, have different colors based on the day when the items were supposed to be shipped out. They had the problem that the laser that was scanning the barcodes couldn't read some of them. And they were all puzzled. And, when I was told this, I was like, oh, I know I know exactly what's going on, because if a red laser scans a blue label, that label appears as black to it, because of the way red and blue interact. Technically it'd be purple, but for the technology we were using, it would be the same as black. I'm not an artist. I'll never be an artist. I can't, I can't draw anything that would be, somebody be willing to pay for, really. As an artist, maybe if I made a name for myself in some field and I sketched something out and signed it, people would be willing to pay it. Not because of the beauty of the sketch, but just because of who I was. But that, because me and my friend had been talking about art and the way light and color interact, I knew the answer that the engineers who were working for the consulting firm didn't, and who should have known, because one of the things that you're taught in engineering is optics and light theory, which is color theory. But because my brothers and I went to a high school where there were certain people who were not college material. Again, not being derisive of such folks. The fact that my brother missed a lot of classes wasn't seen as a big deal, or not just my brother, but lots of other people. Wasn't seen as a big deal because it's like, hey, they'll get this job as an auto mechanic or working, in retail or whatever, and they'll have a decent life. The problem with that is, it shortly became obvious that you couldn't have a decent life working those jobs. And later on, it became obvious that if you didn't have a good education, you were easy prey for a con artist. Or lots of con artists. And I can't quite bridge it, but I'm hoping you can see how the potential of Bradmore figuring out how to successfully perform surgery on people long before germ theory and a whole lot of other scientific stuff was discovered. And how that's comparable, because dude had whatever else he got right or wrong, he had how to do surgery right, it seems. And yet it would take half a millennia before the kinds of things that he did became standard practice. I am fully prepared that, to the idea that 500 years from now, assuming our civilization continues to progress and we continue to advance, I'm fully willing to accept that people in the future will look back at some of the views I hold and say, well, he was right in this area, but he was just a complete asshole in this other area. I can handle that. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that in 500 years, we'll look back and say, they had this thing figured out, but they didn't carry through on it. And because of that, all these people died who might have otherwise lived. All right? So I've I've done everything I can that I know how to do to fight against people dying because of bigotry. While my eldest brother has supported things that are going to cause people to die because of bigotry. But I'm fine with my status to the degree that I've done the best I can, but I'm really irritated that there is a non-zero chance that I failed to grasp something that was simple, that could have led to people surviving who otherwise might not. Whereas, my eldest brother, he doesn't care if marginalized people die because he's a racist, homophobic asshole. And maybe if he had gotten an education that said, well, sure, you're not going to be a surgeon or an engineer or this or that. You're going to do a job that's necessary, but it's not going to require a lot of complicated thoughts on your part, but you still ought to know some of the stuff, and even if you can't even if you can't successfully, for example, talk about what a particular poem means, you've at least read the poem, you've at least been exposed to the stuff. This is a brother who brags that he's never watched an episode of The Simpsons because he thinks it's a bad program, it's offensive, whatever. Said brother watches porn and does not pretend otherwise. He admits it. So, you would think somebody who's devoutly religious would say, whose religion tells them they can't watch The Simpsons, would also believe that their religion would tell them they can't watch porn. But he doesn't. I will have more on this in a future episode, but I gotta get to bed, so I'm wrapping it up now. And as always, may science guide your path.
That's it for this episode of the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes. It's also on Stitcher, and most of the episodes are on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter at tparkatheist, and it's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to donate to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show's notes page. You can also support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker.
Say goodnight, Fosnuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.